Welcome to Reaching Minds, Thoughts for Your Life's Journey. Today, we are going to be pulling back the curtain on a critical, yet often invisible pillar of personal growth. When we work as coaches, facilitators, or consultants, we are often the container for our clients' challenges, ambitions, and stresses. But the question really asked is, who holds the space for our space holders? Today, we're exploring supervision with my guest, Steve Hearsum, who's a consultant, supervisor, coach, and the author of the amazing book, No Silver Bullet, Bursting the Bubble of the Organisational Quick Fix, which examines how leaders and organisations unconsciously collude with quick fixes, the silver bullet solutions for complex organisations. Steve is a board member at Tavistock Institute of Human Relations and was formerly the co-chair of the Organisation Development Network of Europe. Welcome, Steve. Now, we know that supervision is just not a quick checklist or a business review. For me, certainly, it's a sanctuary for reflection, safeguarding against burnout, and the secret ingredient to ethical and high impact practice. So for me, the practice within supervision is an essential part of it. Whether you're a coach, consultant, or a facilitator, and understanding the power of supervision can change not only the relationship you have with yourself and also with your client. So the question that arises for me, and I suspect it might arise for you as well, that we see supervision as an essential part of our practice.
Mhm.
Yet I'm very aware that perhaps others may not see supervision as imperative or important to their own practices. Why do you think that is the case?
I think that there's an element here of we don't know what we don't know. So I was reflecting in the last week, and it's actually something that was sparked by your conversation with Richard Hale on one of your previous podcasts, where he talked about one of the key needs is to help clients face into and become more comfortable with their own ignorance and to acknowledge that, well, they might be ignorant. And certainly earlier on in my career, I didn't have a clue what supervision is. Unless you were in some form of clinical practice or you were doing coaching where there is a relatively strong culture of supervision, the term didn't exist. Actually, and I'd go so far as to say 15, 20 years ago, certainly in organisation development, what tended to be talked about was more shadow consulting. And the term supervision was not as common within the OD consulting space or OD practice space. More broadly, the term is not that well known or that common, I suspect, within the consulting professions. It is very well known in adjacent spaces in clinical consulting and clinical spaces. There, it is a given that you go to clinical supervision or counseling or therapeutic supervision in order to do the work you need to do to get clean after your client engagements or to make sense of the counter-transferences in the projection. But there seems to me to be, whether it's a blind spot or, probably a blind spot, combined with a dose of quite understandable ignorance when it comes to supervision. There's one other aspect of this, which is, if we're really honest, Nita, to be in regular supervision means working on your own shit. And
Indeed.
you and I both know, and I can certainly speak from I here, that there's points in my life when, quite frankly, I didn't want to work on my own stuff. But equally, there are people who, when told, well, if you want to get better at this, might entail you working on your own shit, will, whatever reason, say, well, actually, I'd rather not do that. I'll carry on doing what I'm doing the way I am doing it. Now, that then takes us to the ethical thing, which is, how ethical is it to do that? Because, you wouldn't want your psychotherapist not to be in supervision. And yet, we seem to be quite comfortable with consultants and some coaches not maybe doing the work they might need to be ethical in their practice.
So, one of the dilemmas that sort of raises for me in terms of supervision in particular reference to coaching, because coaching, there's a plethora of coaches out there and it's evolving in many ways, in many shapes. And yeah, and I know like psychotherapy or counseling, which is regulated now, and a few years ago, as we know, it wasn't. How can we have supervision as an ethical practice within the context of coaching, do you think?
So, firstly, the good thing about some of the codes of practice, like the EMCC or the ICF, for example, or Apex, who I'm accredited by, is that a code of practice that advocates that practitioners are in some form of supervision, to me, is supportive of ethical and appropriate practice. Notice I don't use the word professional. I think that can be a bit of a red herring sometimes. The problem comes when I've had a conversation with an ICF accredited coach and supervisor who had some supervision with me recently. And what I picked up from that was, I think, that she noticed her difference to some of the other coaching supervisors she met. And if I was to kind of be quite direct about it, she was more embracing, if you like, of the mess and the contradictions in supervisory practice and in coaching, whereas some of her peers were colluding with the neatness and the need to be very rational and to maybe not pay as much attention to unconscious processes as you or I might. So there's supervision and there's supervision. There's another problem here, which is if you look at consulting supervision, there is nowhere you can go in the UK to become qualified in consulting supervision other than 3 places that I found. There is nowhere you can go to get certified as a consulting supervisor, full stop. I managed to get my accreditation as a consulting supervisor by working with Apex and negotiating with them to the point where they kind of went, we're going to have to go away and look at our standards, which are orientated around coaching supervision, and see if we can make them work for you in consulting supervision. That's how unusual it is. So that's when I say there's an ethical blind spot. That's evidence of this blind spot systemically.
I want to pick up something around, when we're in or doing supervision, because I think it might be helpful to our listeners who perhaps haven't entered into supervision. I, as an experienced supervisor, often see what's happening in the coaching relationship with the supervisor happening as a parallel process of reflection of what's happening between the coach and the client, and how useful that is in spotting that. Because if you can spot it, you can begin to unpick it, I think. Because if you don't spot the parallel processes that's happening, then you're almost not working, as you were sort of saying earlier on, at the sort of unconscious level.
Yeah, and I think the parallel process stuff is fascinating. One of my favourite examples of this is I was running a group supervisory session a couple of years ago online, and I noticed as somebody was working through their case, I was getting really bored. I was tuning out. And when it came to the sense-making bit at the end, I actually said to her and the group, I said, "I noticed I was getting really bored and I was tuning out. Then I actually noticed that you sounded really bored." And I started to wonder whether or not people in the organisation are really bored with all the situation you're describing and everything that's going on. And she paused for a moment. She went, "Yeah." So there's multiple levels there, but working with the parallel process, working with the unconscious dynamics, working with what is being evoked between the supervisor and the supervisee to begin to understand how that might be replicating or mirroring some of what's happening between the supervisee and their client and the client system. That is stuff that I struggle to see how you can do on your own consistently well over a long period of time, and certainly not with your client. Not unless you have a highly sophisticated and very experienced client who understands reflexivity and reflective practice.
Personally, in all the years that I've been supervising, I don't think that can happen, but that's just
I think, yeah, I think
worldview.
it's a really interesting question. I've just you just did this exchange. It gives me. I just asked myself, who amongst my client base could I imagine having that degree of robust, inquiring, reflexive dialogue with? I can think of one or two who I could probably certainly have the contracting conversation where we might experiment with it, but in such a way as we would both know that we might need to say when it is not possible to go any further. I think that's the rider.
Yeah, that is the rider. And, as you know, there have been occasions where, we've been working or I've been working on a project where I think, oh, I need to go and see my supervisor because it is creating such wobbliness inside of me that I'm thinking about it. I'm being consumed by it, that
Yeah.
I need to unpick it. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure that I could just do it on my own, even though I think I'm highly skilled or self-aware. I know that I couldn't have all the perspectives that someone else can offer in that extent. So my question is, how does someone who's a coach or a consultant being supervised directly benefit the end client or the organization they're working with?
If we kind of break that down, there's three levels you basically identified. The supervisee, so my supervisory client, the supervisor's client, sorry, the supervisee's client, and then the wider client system potentially. So if I think about what I noticed with my supervisory client, the thing that strikes me is it's those moments where, and I can see this in myself when I work with my own supervisor, where you kind of shift from being entangled in something of your relationship to and with what is happening with you and the client, and you are able to go, this is mine, that is theirs. And what might this be telling me about me? Might this be telling me about them, it? And what sense do we make of that? But it's that moment of going, oh, hang on a minute. This is not all just joined in one kind of messy ball. So that's for the supervisor. It's that disentangling, I think, is the key thing to enable you to then hold up whatever it is you've been chewing on and go, okay, now I can see more clearly this for what it is or is not. For the supervisee's client, I think about what I observe and I hear from my own supervisees. It's their ability to then re-engage if they are in an ongoing relationship, and to do so sometimes actually with a bit more compassion. And sometimes it might be to actually go in and be even more challenging. It's normally as a precursor to considering, well, what intervention now? And another cycle of inquiry with the client. The wider client system, and for me, this is the ripples bit. It's creating the potential for something that might increase the compression such that there is some kind of a shift, but with no guarantee that it's going to be a positive one or not. But what becomes less likely is a status quo. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So what you're saying is there's movement, really.
There is movement, and I've been thinking a lot about collusive processes, not just because of the book, but other stuff I've been reading recently, and complicity, and how we are complicit with people and systems around power. And it's quite difficult to disentangle yourself from that, to make a clear choice to say or to do something or show up in a way that might challenge that kind of dynamic.
And to build on that, that's precisely the issue you can take to supervision to help you to do that.
Yeah, and there is something, and it comes from Eric DeHaan from Ashridge, in his work on his writing on supervision. He talks about the importance of creating an environment where shameful things can be said and talked about. That you can bring your shame as a practitioner and go, oh my goodness, I said this happened, or I said this and it didn't work, or I didn't feel like thought I didn't know what I was doing. You can bring the unsayable stuff or the stuff you feared that might actually be evoking shame in you, that you would not say to your client. but you still have to process it. Otherwise, it's with you in your client interactions. So that space to process your shame and anxiety is absolutely crucial when it comes to supervision.
Now, you're someone, Steve, who's run very many group supervision courses. And how do you attract potential coachees or consultants to come and join your practice as a group supervisor or an individual supervisor?
Well, I suppose other than metaphorically running around with a t-shirt and blaze and saying, "Come and do this, it's wonderful," I largely, and the equivalent of doing that on LinkedIn. There's a proportion of people that find their way to me by word of mouth. The common thread or the common factor between them, I think, even if they're internals or externals, is that they are attracted or they find me, or when I start talking, they are drawn to it because they are normally in a place they need to, or they've started chewing on something quite hard. There's sometimes kind of existential practice questions, such as, falling out of love with OD, or really struggling with their role in a particular organization. They're kind of going, "What is my place here? I'm going slowly mad." So I talk about how internal practitioners are often the nodes through which the crazy flows. And once people start to notice that and engage with the craziness, that then really starts to raise the need to find somewhere to talk about this stuff and to make sense of it. So they tend to be people who are at a point where they begin to see the contradictions and absurdities in organizational life, and are kind of going, "I need to talk about this. I can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore."
Before we continue, I'd love to invite you to visit my website, where you'll find more resources to support your personal and professional journey. Whether you're exploring leadership development, coaching, supervision, or inclusive workplaces, you can go and visit there for deeper reflections to help you to grow. You'll find everything at nitasharma.com. It's also the best place to connect with me directly and discover what's coming up. And of course, there are all the back catalogue episodes of podcasts that you can tap into and gain lots of wisdoms and reflections. It's quite interesting because I think my perspective around coaching is that perhaps coaching is going into supervision is still seen as, which I guess about 10 years ago, people going into coaching, is that there's a deficit. That's why you're going in there.
Deficit in yourself.
Yes. That you're going to go and have coaching. It used to be around psychotherapy and counseling.
I see what you mean. So if you're going to have coaching,
Yeah,
because there's something
that's it.
yeah.
And I've heard in the sort of spheres, supervision is about going into supervision is about fixing you as well. So, which I don't subscribe to, by the way, because I think when individuals who seek supervision, it's to really harness their tools, is to fine tune them, is to expand where their blind spots are, and rather than, "Oh, well, I need to go and become a better coach," in a sense.
I think I've gone through my phase of kind of wrestling or complaining about the label coach and the term coaching. I do think it's problematic. I can't think of an alternative frame. I do tend to think more in terms of one-to-one consulting and coaching. I think it's a far more helpful. But when I saw something on LinkedIn that a friend of mine sent to me 3 weeks ago. He sent it to me knowing that it would provoke me. And it was somebody who was a coach who posted, and I quote, "Excellent coaches don't answer questions, they question answers."
Oh.
And once I'd finished dry retching, a more serious response to that is it any wonder that people go to coaches with a degree of conscious or unconscious trepidation, one downness, when there are coaches out there who have possibly unconsciously such a absurd ego ideal? My good friend and colleague Simon Cavicchia, who's written extensively about this, he talks a lot about shame in the coaching relationship. And I remember him saying to me a few years ago that on one cohort on a master's program he ran, but the biggest challenge was helping the former business leaders who were becoming coaches to get over their shame that they couldn't guarantee the success of their coaching clients.
Yeah, and we often get hooked into that,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to, I was just thinking, Mita, I like to say that I don't get hooked. And I just caught myself. I went, no, I can own that. I can own
Yeah.
part of me does want, I can say rationally, the success here is dependent on you. It's not dependent on me. But another part of me is going, but I need to make sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's quite a human condition. And it's about having that self-awareness of pulling back from that and recognizing that you're not omnipotent in this relationship. And picking that.
What's just hit me is, and again, I can own this because I recognize my own grandiosity and my own arrogance. There's a grandiosity and arrogance to some of the rhetoric around coaching. And if nothing else, we need to go to supervision to have that knocked out of us. A good supervisor, an effective supervisor, will hold the mirror up to your grandiosity and arrogance.
Which is, I think that's one of the key roles around supervision. And certainly I know my supervisor has held the mirror and has challenged me. I remember the very first time I went, because I was going, I was just talk. She said, oh, that's an interesting there's a defense around really allowing people to come in. I thought, oh my God, she's got me. And it was the very first session of supervision I had many moons ago. Now, some people might say, they've been coaching, consulting for years, and they think, well, supervision is just for beginners, and they don't really need it because, they're pretty senior in what they've been doing. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question. I mean, my thoughts on that are threefold initially. One, if you're a beginner, you're genuinely at the beginning of your, if we're talking about coaching, and I could argue actually if you're a kind of early stage career consultant, then money might be an issue. And let's be really honest, paying for a supervisor costs money. And it may not be something that you're flushing at the beginning of your coaching practice. And it would be a great investment and help you with your marketing to say, I may be new and I'm in supervision because I want to do this well and I want to do this well from the off. Brilliant bit of positioning. It took me a lot longer than that to properly get into supervision myself. It's good to have some kind of sense-making space at any stage of your coaching or consulting career. Does it have to be a formal supervision space? No. Does it have to have a supervisory quality? I'd argue yes, even if it's like a peer or shadow consulting group. And your kind of question around does the need increase? I would say it does ramp up in relationship to both volume and or the complexity of the clients and their contexts. So when I think about my own kind of workload of one-to-one clients, whether they're supervisees or coaches, then I absolutely feel my need to have a space to yak up an odd furball or two to make sense of what's going on. That goes up in direct proportion to the number. And as the number increases, the likelihood of me having one or two clients that are more challenging for me that's going to go up as well. So yeah, it does increase, I think.
And I guess the other side for me is, Steve, thinking about what are the consequences if we don't tap into a supervisory relationship. What's the emotional impact that we might have on ourselves or indeed on our clients or the organization we're working with?
If I speak from my sense of, again, what I notice in others, it's just that you simply end up carrying more of the emotional load because you have nowhere to make sense of it. That at a very human level is that I have nowhere to process it. Therefore, I just carry it for longer instead of being able to work it through with you and go, "Oh, okay, now I can see it more clearly. That lessens the emotional load. I can see the world for how it is, not how I feel or imagine it is. But more importantly, is it more important? No, I think it's probably equally important. It's not more important. If I'm not doing that work, I'm not disentangling myself. and I might remain entangled in the very dynamics and mess that my client has invited me in to help with. I become part of the problem and the dance that is going on, not an observer of the dance who can help me see the moves they're making that may no longer be useful.
And I guess the example I could come up with that in reference to what you just said is staying, long term with one client or coaching the client or consulting the client, and it's like the lines are a bit blurred, basically. And there might be other factors apart from your own ethical practices, might be to do with money or the continuation of the work. And I certainly, some people, I've supervised, they've often had a very complex relationship with the coachee, and the organization. And when they brought it to supervision, I've sort of pointed that out to them in terms of the lack of clear boundaries. And I wonder whether that person would have got to that if it hadn't been in a supervisory relationship. So I don't know. Maybe they would have done. Maybe they wouldn't have done.
So what popped into my head when you were talking, I don't know why, but what popped into my head was a wondering around, what role does our often very human need and desire to be liked play here? And my supervisor, Jean, who's had a long history with the Tavistock, she was one of the central figures there for a long number of years. But I was processing a client engagement with her 3 years ago, a large group intervention, and there were about 80 people. It was quite tough. I wasn't sure how it had gone down. My primary clients were very happy. They thought it had gone really well. The senior leader thought it had gone well. And then the feedback I had from one fairly large subset of it was they didn't trash the intervention on me, but it wasn't positive. They didn't particularly like it. And Jean said to me, "Well, of course they're not going to like you. You just spent a day helping them, and inviting them and asking them to look at what they don't want to look at. They're not going to thank you for that. So well done," in a sense, what she said. Why would they be grateful to you for making them or in their eyes, you making them feel uncomfortable? Whereas actually it's their discomfort. Yeah, I can feel that, the work we've done with the clients. I think we've talked about that wrestle between we want to be liked, but at the same time, actually, sometimes it's actually not very helpful for our clients to like us.
No, indeed. Sometimes it's best for them not to like you. Now, for listeners who are thinking about supervision, what's the difference between that and mentoring? They might say, isn't supervision a bit like mentoring? I have a mentor that I can go and have a chat with. And
I think it's a really good question. My flip answer is, well, they're similar yet different. And I could collude with the idea that of course, with supervision, you do a lot more development and it's a well-formed practice. But when I think about, a really rich mentoring relationship with somebody who really understands what it is to be a mentor, there are I think, some interesting parallels. Because, one of the things that I think just really distinguishes a supervisor from a coach, for example, and this is similar to the difference between a coach and a mentor, is just that a supervisor is not neutral. Well, it's a myth anyway that coaches are neutral, by the way. That's a total myth. Mentors, you don't want them to be neutral because you want them to have an opinion on your context, your career, your choices. You're coming to them precisely because of their world experience. Supervision, there's a kind of a similarity there. You're going to a supervisor to get a perspective or a number of perspectives, a different perspective based on their experience of the field, the theory of practice, and you want them to offer their opinion. Yes, you want them to ask you questions, of course, but you're not expecting them to remain neutral throughout it. I think the primary difference where they kind of separate is just that a mentor will not, unless they have that as part of their practice, they will not have done any supervisory development.
yeah.
Therefore, they don't have, for example, let's take something out of the air. They don't have necessary understanding of system psychodynamics, so they can't talk about transference and countertransference and parallel process. But they could do a bloody good job of helping you make sense of your context, born of their experience and their distance from your experience.
So I guess what we're saying is that if you have a great mentor, they might be able to do some of that stuff, and a supervisor may do that and perhaps a little bit more in that in your supervisory relationship.
Yeah, I think there's also something about power here, which is or well, it's not quite power and projection, which is if you think about what. So I had a client recently ask me. We talked about helping them find a mentor. So they were looking for somebody who'd walked somewhere and been somewhere where my client wanted to walk also. They were wanting to learn from their experience of moving into senior leadership roles in a particular sector, and automatically, often would that's probably the most often thing I hear is, "I want to find a mentor who has worked in the field that I aspire to be in. I want to learn about that." And immediately, that sets up an interesting paradigm
Dynamic, yeah.
and the potential for unhealthy deference. You can learn from somebody's experience at a more senior level. It doesn't mean you have to defer to that experience. It's not the same thing. Whereas with a supervisor, I would suggest that what you want to be working towards is an eye-to-eye relationship where you're not putting your supervisor on an unconscious pedestal.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just building on that one, finally, an individual who's seeking to have a supervisor, how can they ensure that the qualities of the supervisor they should be looking for? And is it just about, someone who reinforces everything, or somebody who challenges or makes them feel uncomfortable, or all of those things? I don't know. I mean, what could an individual who's embarking, or who wants to do supervision, could be looking for in a
Well,
supervisor?
there's a balance here between enough affinity, or e.g., you don't have diametrically opposing worldviews. So, put it in crude terms, if you see the world of organisations is inherently complex and messy, and your supervisor sees them as actually through the lens of a machine metaphor, you're probably not going to be right for each other. But equally, you don't want somebody who is so aligned and so in lockstep with you that you're violently agreeing with each other. You want somebody who does have enough difference about them, not just so that can offer a different perspective, but they are also willing to um, say what they're seeing, and to also are quite comfortable pointing out what you might not be seeing of your own failings, your own missteps. Um, I was talking to a friend earlier today, and we were talking about supervision, and they said to me that their supervisor a couple of years ago wagged their finger at him and said, words effective, "Look, you really do need to get more comfortable with helping your clients get uncomfortable," or words to that effect. Kind of pushing at that it's not your job to make them like you.
Yeah, yeah.
You need a supervisor who's prepared to call you out when you're colluding.
Yeah, I think that is true, and, certainly I know one of the qualities I was looking for when I was seeking a supervisor, somebody who understood my experience as someone from a particular, ethnicity. So that wasn't the only criteria I was looking for, but that was quite pivotal for me.
I think that is absolutely right, and I think there are moments where making a really explicit choice around a particular background, both professional practice and also personal and cultural, is really important. Yeah, totally. The same applies for coaching as well. I own my cards of privilege. I'm, a straight white, middle-aged, middle-class man who lives in Brighton, and I will say to clients, that up front that I know this. It's interesting, Nita. I would say 60 to 70% of my coaching clients in recent years have been female,
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
and
I think it is about owning to it.
yeah, it's owning that. And it's because I'm very upfront about what I am and what I'm not. And that creates a permission and a freedom for us then to talk about that which might otherwise remain undiscussed.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room that nobody ever
Yeah.
sees. But if you make it explicit, and I guess it's the same for me within the context even of coaching, if you make that explicit, then it doesn't have to be something that is in the way. As we know, there are always sort of dynamics happening unconsciously, which we may not even realize. And I guess there are some similarities with supervision. So any final thoughts that you would like to leave our listeners with around supervision, Steve?
I guess the first thing is, what is it you're imagining a supervisor is or is not going to do for you and with you? What fantasies do you have about a supervisor is and is not? And the second thing is, notice whether or not you're construing your practice in a binary way. What I find really interesting is how somehow rather, let's just take the two modes we talked about, how coaching and consulting are somehow rather regarded as separate. And I don't explicitly go for coaching supervisees. What I say is I primarily focus on consulting and change practitioners, right? But a large number of those people who I work with also have a coaching practice. So I would argue that you need to find a supervisor who is able to work across the disciplines. Because if you're a coach who also has a consulting practice, why the hell are you going to somebody who just does coaching?
I get that completely. I think the systemic part of it is really important as a part of the coaching, that's a supervisory relationship.
Yeah.
I think that is having that bigger context at the same time. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Steve. This has been a very, how can I say, flowing conversation. And even though I had the questions, we maneuvered around them, and some of them I didn't even ask. So, as always, there are insights that certainly I'm walking away with. And thank you very much for agreeing again to be part of these podcasts.
Absolute pleasure. Delighted to be asked again.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope the conversation gave you something valuable to reflect on as you move through your week. Reaching Minds is all about supporting your growth, expanding your awareness, and helping you navigate life with more clarity and confidence. If today's episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe or follow the podcast so you never miss an update. I would also love to hear your thoughts, questions, or reflections. You can leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/Nita Sharma. I listen to every message and often weave your insights into future episodes. Thank you again for joining me. Until next time, take good care of yourself and keep reaching for the ideas and perspectives that help you to grow.